In this video, we'll learn about ought to. Ought to. Ought to is a modal verb that is similar to should, except we have to use to after ought. When these two words are said together quickly, it sounds a little bit like oughta. Ought to or oughta. In spoken English, oughta is a very common expression. So we know that ought to is equal to or it is similar to should. Oughta or ought to is used when requiring some medical help. You ought to see a doctor. Ought to is often used before situations requiring medical help. The main verb is see over here. In this sentence, the main verb is see. You could replace ought to with should. We can replace it with should quite easily. Ought to see a doctor. You ought to see a doctor, or you should see a doctor. They have the same meaning. They ought to be careful. They ought to, or they should be careful. The verb be over here is often used with ought to. This one. They ought to be careful. The verb be is often used with ought to. So this is the main verb over here. So they should be careful or they ought to be careful. Both give the same sense. Now, the government ought to provide more help for those people. Here is the main verb. The government ought to provide. So this word provide is the main verb over here in this particular sentence. Ought to provide more help for those people. So here provide is the main verb. This is the main verb, and there is an obligation. There is an obligation on the part of the government to do something. In this sort of situations, this ought to is a good choice, because the government ought to provide more help for those people. So there is an obligation on the part of the government. The government ought to provide more help for those people. The people are needy, so it is the obligation of the government, or it is the obligation on the part of the government to provide more help. When you give some recommendations, or you are recommending something. So as I said, when you give recommendations or offer something, either you give some recommendation or offer some advice. What is that? That offer should be an advice. Then this expression is very common. I think. We just start with the phrase I think. I think comes before ought to. This is ought to, and before that we have to put this particular expression I think. So I think comes before ought to with that subject. This is the subject over here. you. This is the subject. So when talking to another person, start with I think you ought to take a break. So this is actually giving recommendations, or it is offering advice. So for that purpose, we have to put this I think in the beginning, followed by a subject and then this ought to. To make ought to negative, put not right after ought. Over here, right after this word ought, and before to, put not over here. So as I said, to make ought to negative, put not right after ought and then the infinitive. We know this, to, and then this is the main verb, do. They ought not to do. So this is an infinitive over here. Remember that we can't split an infinitive. We are unable to split an infinitive. We can't put not just after to. We can't say they ought to not do that. That will be an incorrect expression. They ought not to do that. This is correct. Just after ought, we have to put not, and then there will be an infinitive to do. We ought not to be late. So again, just after ought, we have to put this not, and then there is the main verb be. And to be is an infinitive in this case also. So to be is again an infinitive. So remember that we can't split an infinitive. To not be will be incorrect. So again, as I said, remember that we can't split an infinitive. It has to be together. It should be together. So here is the infinitive to be. To be. So as I said, they ought not to do that. It is possible sometimes we hear that take off to. For example, we may take off to from this particular expression. We may say we ought not be late. We may say that. Or they ought not do that. So it is possible sometimes we hear that take off to out of this. We may take this particular to out of this expression. And it is also possible to make a contraction. That will be oughtn't. Oughtn't. This is better. So as I said, this is possible to make a contraction and say oughtn't. This is something many people don't use, or this is something many people don't do, but you might hear it sometimes. Here is a good example of using ought with the negative without to when it's a verb be. We ought not to be late. If we put to here, we ought not to be late. That's also fine. If we put to over here, this is fine. But if we take it out or take it off, it's a just matter of personal preference. We may opt for we ought not to be late, or we ought not be late. Both are correct. Now, use ought to when there is some sort of expectations. We ought to be here soon. Over here in this particular sentence, this be is the main verb, and before that we have used ought to. So here is the main verb. We expect somebody to arrive very soon, so she ought to be here soon. It means there are some expectations, or there is an expectation, and we expect somebody to arrive very soon. Another sentence on the basis of this expectation: the team ought to do well this season. So over here, this is the main verb. If we join these together, it becomes an infinitive. The team ought to do well this season. It means that it's again possible to use should in place of ought to over here. We may replace it by the team should do well this season. Instead of ought to, we may use should. So there is an expectation this season based on the performance of the team. So the team ought to do well this season. There is expectations. There are expectations, or there is an expectation that the team is going to do well this season, or the team should do well this season. Ought to is often used in simple expressions where it is very similar to say that ought to do it, just like this, that ought to do it. So this is the main verb over here, ought to do, that ought to do it. It means that should do it, or which is equal to saying that's enough. It means that ought to do it. It is similar to saying that's enough or that's all we need. These two expressions are the sense given by this one. That ought to do it, that's enough, that's all we need. But this is going to be preferred. So this is something that is very common. There is not a need for anything else. We ought to be grateful for what we have. So as I said, that in this situation, there is not a need for anything else or anything in addition to what we already have. Here is another very popular expression using ought to. This popular expression is we ought to be grateful. So over here, this ought to, and then this word grateful. This is very commonly used expression, very popular expression that is actually using ought to. We ought to be grateful for what we have. We ought to be grateful. So over here, the word be is the main verb in this particular sentence. We ought to be grateful for what we have. Grateful, why grateful? Grateful because we are fortunate to have food, shelter, clothing, safety, a good life. That's why we have to be grateful. So this expression is very popular one. We ought to be grateful for what we have. So by using this ought to, this popular expression comes into existence. Hope this will help this concept to be clarified. Thanks a lot.